young men. For young men.
And for young men, don't be new scum. Yes, see, dear young men, you have amazing role models like our handsome, dashing president. And you have amazing role models like the assassin JD Vance, our vice president. And when I say that,
trust me, there's nothing new under the sun that I have not heard, so you're fine. Yes, we did. I love you.
What you just watched isn't some fringe moment tucked away in an obscure corner of the internet. What you just witnessed is the complete and utter moral collapse of conservative America happening in real time at one of the most influential gatherings of the American right. And before we even begin to unpack the layers upon layers of grotesque complicity and normalized violence embedded in this clip, before we even start dissecting the ways in which celebrity worship has been weaponized to launder fascist rhetoric through pop culture gloss, I need you to understand the stakes here because Erika Kirk, who took the helm after the assassination of her husband Charlie Kirk, has endorsed Vance as a potential successor to President Donald Trump, and this isn't just political theater. This is the construction of a pipeline from assassination to succession, from mourning to empire building, and it's all happening while Nicki Minaj stands on that stage calling the Vice President of the United States an assassin to thunderous applause. And what I'm about to lay out for you is going to make your blood boil, because this moment encapsulates everything that's wrong with MAGA culture, everything that's dangerous about the normalization of political violence, and everything that reveals the hollowness at the core of the conservative movement's performative morality. Let's start with the context that makes this moment so absolutely chilling, because this year's gathering is the first since TPUSA founder Charlie Kirk was assassinated in September, and the MAGA movement so lockstep when President Trump was running, and largely unified by TPUSA founder Charlie Kirk before his assassination this fall, is engulfed in an overt power struggle ahead of 2028. So we're talking about a conference happening mere months after a political assassination that should have prompted deep national reflection about the rhetoric and violence plaguing our democracy, and instead what do we get? We get Nicki Minaj casually dropping the word assassin to describe JD Vance. We get Erika Kirk laughing it off like it's just another slip of the tongue. We get a crowd that doesn't gasp in horror but rather accepts it as part of the show. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what we're witnessing is the normalization thesis playing out in front of our eyes, the way that the threat today is not widespread insurgent violence. It is the steady decline of the norm that violence is illegitimate in politics, and a democracy can erode even with relatively few violent incidents if citizens and elites increasingly view those incidents as understandable or justified. Now let's talk about what Erika Kirk does in this moment, because her response is arguably more disturbing than Minaj's comment itself. She immediately recognizes the faux pas. She acknowledges that calling the vice president an assassin mere months after her husband was literally assassinated might be, slightly problematic. But then what does she do? She waves it away with this saccharine "we know what's in your heart" nonsense. And this is the playbook they've perfected. This is how violent rhetoric gets sanitized and mainstreamed. You take the inflammatory language, you acknowledge just enough to show you're not completely oblivious, and then you dismiss it as a matter of intent rather than impact. You prioritize the relationship with the celebrity over the message being sent to millions of viewers, and in doing so you signal that words don't actually matter as long as you're on the right team, as long as you're part of the MAGA family, as long as you're willing to show up and praise Trump and Vance as role models for young men. And speaking of that phrase, role models for young men, let's dive into the ideological swamp that represents, because Nicki Minaj used her time on stage to praise President Donald Trump and Vice President JD Vance, calling them role models for young men. And what exactly are we modeling here? What are we telling young men to aspire to when we elevate these figures? We're telling them that power matters more than principle, that wealth matters more than wisdom, that performative masculinity matters more than actual character, and this comes at a moment when Vance appeared ready to embrace the racially charged rhetoric that Fuentes supporters now increasingly expect for their leading figures, telling the crowd, in the United States of America, you don't have to apologize for being white anymore. The role model we're offering young men is someone who's courting white nationalist sentiment, someone who's refusing to draw red lines around bigotry, someone who's telling a conference I didn't bring a list of conservatives to denounce or to deplatform after a long weekend of debates about whether the movement should exclude figures such as bigoted podcaster Nick Fuentes. But here's where it gets even more insidious. Here's where the celebrity culture war machinery really kicks into high gear, because Nicki Minaj isn't just some random famous person who wandered onto that stage. The Trinidadian-born rapper can be found trading compliments and memes on social media with Vice President JD Vance, ranting against transgender kids, and representing the administration at the United Nations. And this represents a calculated strategy by the Trump administration to launder their rhetoric through cultural figures who can reach audiences that would never tune into CPAC or watch a congressional hearing, because public perception of Minaj's alignment shifted more noticeably in 2025, when she began directly engaging with Trump-aligned narratives, administration messaging, and people closely aligned with the MAGA leader. And what we're seeing is the construction of an alternative cultural ecosystem where transphobia gets packaged as common sense, where Christian nationalism gets sold as faith protection, where anti-immigrant sentiment gets framed as border security, all delivered through the mouth of someone who built her career on the backs of queer fans and marginalized communities. And let's be crystal clear about what Minaj is doing here, because the most unfortunately memorable moment came when the superstar rapper praised the assassin JD Vance, leading to some awkward silence, with Kirk's husband Charlie having been cut down by a sniper 3.5 months ago. So we're 3.5 months out from a sniper assassination at a college campus, and someone is using assassination rhetoric to praise a sitting vice president, and the response is awkward silence, followed by laughter and dismissal, not condemnation, not a statement about the dangers of violent political language, not a moment of reflection about how rhetoric shapes reality, just a quick "we know your heart," and moving right along. And this is exactly what researchers mean when they talk about the normalization of political violence, because when leaders normalize hostility, when influencers amplify fear, and when parties outsource mobilization to extremists, political violence ceases to be unthinkable and becomes inevitable. Now I want to zoom out for a second, because this moment at Turning Point USA doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's happening within a broader landscape, where in the first half of 2025, 35% of violent events tracked by University of Maryland researchers targeted U.S. government personnel or facilities, more than twice the rate in 2024, and right-wing extremist violence has been deadlier than left-wing violence in recent years. Yet Trump and his surrogates have spent months claiming that the left is responsible for political violence. They've cited instances in which the right was targeted while ignoring other examples. They've created this entirely fabricated narrative where they're the victims of left-wing terror, despite all evidence pointing in the opposite direction. And here's Nicki Minaj on their stage using the language of assassination to describe their chosen successor while everyone claps and cheers. And we need to talk about the Charlie Kirk mythology that's being constructed in real time at this conference, because Vance spoke about Charlie Kirk multiple times, saying, "If you miss Charlie Kirk, do you promise to fight what he died for? Do you promise to help defeat the radicals who cheered his death?" And Vance alluded to more prosecutions, offering that he and President Donald Trump have a list of better judges and prosecutors to enact swifter justice. So what we're seeing is the weaponization of grief, the transformation of a tragedy into a call for retribution, the construction of a martyr narrative that justifies future authoritarian action. And when Vance talks about having a list of prosecutors and promising swifter justice, he's not talking about justice in any meaningful sense. He's talking about using state power to punish political opponents. He's talking about the very thing they accuse the left of doing, and he's doing it while standing in front of a crowd that just heard the vice president described as an assassin without anyone batting an eye. But let's get back to the celebrity dimension of this, because it matters immensely how this message is being delivered, and by whom. Nicki Minaj has found a home in the MAGA attention economy, where outrage is currency and cruelty is content, and the tragedy here is that, unlike Kanye West, Minaj's career was built on the backs of queer people. She cultivated a fan base of marginalized people who saw her as an icon of empowerment and representation, and now she's using that platform to amplify an administration that's actively hostile to those very communities. She's expressing her disdain for the usurping of traditional gender roles and suggesting that white women have been the victims of reverse discrimination. She's appearing at conferences where the vice president says, "The only thing that has truly served as an anchor of the United States of America is that we have been, and by the grace of God we always will be, a Christian nation." And what makes this particularly galling is that her transformation isn't even ideologically coherent, it's transparently transactional. Because here's what Minaj gets out of this arrangement. The White House subsequently tweeted posts of Minaj's full-throated endorsement of the Trump administration. She gets access to power. She gets to speak at the United Nations. She gets Vice President JD Vance weighing in on her rap beefs. She gets a level of institutional validation that her music hasn't generated in years. And what does the administration get? They get a black woman rapper, telling young men to model themselves after Trump and Vance. They get someone who can say things about trans kids and immigration that would sound too harsh coming from a Republican senator, but sound like just speaking your mind coming from a celebrity. They get cultural cover for their authoritarian project, and everyone just pretends this is normal political discourse rather than the grotesque spectacle it actually is. And let's talk about the specific phrase "words are words" that Erika Kirk deploys, because that's doing so much ideological work in that moment. It's the ultimate dismissal of accountability. It's saying that language has no real-world consequences, that we can throw around terms like assassin in the context of political leadership without worrying about what that might signal or enable. And this is particularly rich coming from a movement that spent years claiming that leftist rhetoric about fascism and authoritarianism was dangerous and inflammatory. Coming from a movement where they've often cited those who compared Trump and Kirk to Nazis or called them fascists, with Trump saying this kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now. So when they use Nazi comparisons or talk about enemies of the people or deploy violent imagery, that's just telling it like it is. But when progressives accurately describe authoritarian behavior as authoritarian, that's dangerous incitement, and this double standard isn't a bug in their system, it's the entire operating principle. Now I need you to understand something about what's happening with JD Vance specifically at this conference, because Vance has come under mounting pressure in recent weeks to condemn and bar from the conservative movement Nick Fuentes, a young podcaster who peddles white supremacist views and anti-Semitic tropes, underscoring the Republican Party's divisions over the rise of fringe activists who were barely known by the public until recently, and his response has been to say, "We don't care if you're white or black, rich or poor, young or old, rural or urban, controversial or a little bit boring, or somewhere in between," and his comments came in the midst of an increasingly contentious debate over whether the right should give a platform to commentators espousing anti-Semitic views, particularly Fuentes, whose followers see themselves as working to preserve America's white Christian identity, so Vance is actively refusing to set boundaries around white supremacy and anti-Semitism. He's positioning himself as the big tent candidate who welcomes everyone, including literal Nazis, as long as they love America. And this is the person Nicki Minaj is calling a role model. This is the person she's praising in language that evokes assassination. And Erika Kirk is nodding along saying, "We know your heart." And here's what makes this particularly dystopian. The 4-day event has become a focal point for internal conservative movement debates, featuring high-profile disputes among right-wing commentators and a strong push to inspire young conservative activists following Kirk's assassination in September. So this conference is explicitly about mobilizing young people in the wake of a political assassination. It's about channeling grief and rage into political energy, and the way they're doing that is by platforming celebrity endorsements that use violent rhetoric while simultaneously claiming victimhood from left-wing violence. And if you think this is hyperbole, if you think I'm overstating the danger here, I want you to remember that if the people who lead us are using violent or dehumanizing rhetoric, then it's a signal to their supporters that violent rhetoric is acceptable, and that violent action might be acceptable. When we're not talking about abstract theoretical risk, we're talking about measurable increases in threats and violence, because let's be absolutely clear about the data here. Based on government and independent analyses, right-wing extremist violence has been responsible for the overwhelming majority of fatalities, amounting to approximately 75 to 80% of U.S. domestic terrorism deaths since 2001. But you wouldn't know that from listening to Trump or Vance or anyone at this conference. You'd think we're living through a left-wing reign of terror. You'd think Antifa is burning down cities and radical socialists are assassinating conservative leaders, when the reality is almost exactly the opposite. And this inversion of reality isn't just dishonest, it's dangerous because it provides justification for further right-wing violence. It creates a permission structure where people can convince themselves they're defending America against left-wing terrorists when they're actually the ones enacting political violence. And I want to come back to this notion of role models for young men, because this is where the ideological poison really seeps in. What does it mean to hold up Trump and Vance as aspirational figures for young men? It means teaching them that you can lie constantly and face no consequences. It means teaching them that you can be credibly accused of sexual misconduct and still ascend to the highest offices in the land. It means teaching them that you can flirt with authoritarianism and white nationalism as long as you do it with a wink and maintain plausible deniability. It means teaching them that power is its own justification, that might makes right, that the only thing that matters is winning, and this is being sold to young men in a moment when the number of threats against elected officials has been skyrocketing, and the Capitol Police said that in 2024, they had more threats against members of Congress than ever before, so we're already in a crisis of political violence and intimidation, and the response from MAGA world is to double down, to bring in celebrities who'll call the vice president an assassin, to frame it all as harmless entertainment, to say words are just words, as if language doesn't shape consciousness and enable action. Now let's talk about what this moment reveals about the conservative movement's relationship to violence more broadly, because Trump and his MAGA allies have often been rather callous and cavalier about political violence when it wasn't their side targeted, and perhaps the most remarkable example in recent years was the Paul Pelosi attack, which became a punchline for many, including Trump. So when Nancy Pelosi's husband is brutally attacked with a hammer in his own home, that's funny, that's material for jokes. But when someone on their side faces violence, suddenly it's a national emergency that requires prosecution and retribution, and this selective empathy isn't just morally bankrupt, it's strategically deployed to justify authoritarian measures, because if you can convince your supporters that they're under siege from left-wing violence while simultaneously laughing off violence against your opponents, you create a psychological state where any action in defense of the movement becomes justified. And we need to examine the specific role that Turning Point USA plays in this ecosystem, because MAGA speakers torched each other as pompous, cancerous cowards at this weekend's 30,000-person Turning Point USA America Fest, accelerating the right's media meltdown over Israel, hate speech and more. So this isn't even a unified movement, it's a fractious coalition held together mainly by opposition to the left and loyalty to Trump, and into this chaos steps Erika Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, trying to hold together an organization built around her dead husband's cult of personality, and the way she's doing that is by anointing JD Vance as the successor, by bringing in celebrities like Nicki Minaj to provide cultural cachet, by papering over the violent rhetoric with appeals to heartfelt intentions, and the whole thing would be darkly comic if it weren't so genuinely terrifying, because here's what's actually happening beneath the surface of this celebrity spectacle. The event suggested a movement struggling to reconcile its populist, nationalist, and traditional conservative factions, and what emerged in Phoenix was less a unified front than a snapshot of a coalition in flux, and one increasingly shaped by internal battles over ideology, loyalty, and power. So this movement is coming apart at the seams. It's cannibalizing itself over questions about how far right is too far right, whether to platform open anti-Semites, whether to embrace or distance themselves from the most extreme elements, and the only thing holding it together is the Trump brand and the promise of power in 2028. And JD Vance is positioning himself as the heir apparent by refusing to condemn anyone, by keeping the tent as big as possible, by signaling that he'll welcome white nationalists and QAnon believers and anyone else who'll show up to vote. And Nicki Minaj calling him an assassin is just the perfect accidental metaphor for what he actually represents, the death of any remaining moral boundaries within conservative politics. And I want you to think about what it means that this is all happening at what's described as a youth conference. Turning Point plays offense with a sense of urgency to win America's culture war, and with over 900+ chapters, TPUSA's college program is the nation's largest youth movement, reshaping campus culture and energizing students. So this organization is explicitly focused on indoctrinating young people, on capturing them at the most impressionable stage of their lives, on teaching them that this kind of rhetoric is normal and acceptable, on modeling this kind of relationship to power and violence, and they're doing it with slick production values and celebrity guests and all the trappings of mainstream entertainment, making it feel less like political radicalization and more like just another conference, just another cultural event, just another opportunity to hear from influential people. And this is precisely how extremism becomes normalized, not through jackbooted thugs marching in the streets, but through gradual acclimation, through repeated exposure, through the slow erosion of the sense that certain things are beyond the pale. Now let's talk about the specific context of Charlie Kirk's death, because after Kirk's assassination on a college campus in Utah, the vice president flew out on Air Force Two to collect Kirk's remains and bring them home to Arizona, and the vice president helped uniformed service members carry the casket to the plane. So Vance has personally involved himself in the martyrdom narrative. He's used the resources of his office to elevate Kirk's death to the level of a state funeral. He's signaled that Kirk was not just a political activist, but a fallen hero in some great civilizational struggle, and this matters because it frames what comes next. It provides justification for the swifter justice he's promising, for the prosecutions he's threatening, for the authoritarian measures that will be sold as honoring Charlie Kirk's memory and defeating those who celebrated his death. And we should be absolutely clear about what's being threatened here, because when Vance says, "Do you want more prosecutions?" Great. So do we. Donald Trump and I have a list of better judges and prosecutors to enact swifter justice. He's not talking about prosecuting actual criminals. He's talking about using the justice system as a weapon against political opponents. He's talking about the thing that authoritarian leaders always do, which is claim that they're the victims while actively preparing to victimize others. And he's saying this at a conference where someone just called him an assassin to applause, where the language of violence is treated as entertainment, where the boundaries between metaphor and threat have been deliberately blurred, and if you don't see the danger in that combination, you're not paying attention. But let's zoom back in on Nicki Minaj for a moment, because her role in this is particularly insidious. The rap star was interviewed about her newly found support for Trump, someone she had condemned in the past, and the female rapper's recent alignment with the Make America Great Again movement has caught some interest because of her past criticism of Trump, even when the artist's own political ideology had been difficult to pin down. And in fact, in 2018, Minaj was one of several celebrities condemning Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy that split more than 5,000 children from their families at the Mexico border, and back then she shared her own story of arriving to the country at 5 years old, describing herself as an illegal immigrant, saying, "This is so scary to me. Please stop this. Can you try to imagine the terror and panic these kids feel right now?" So she went from condemning family separation, as someone who personally understood the immigrant experience, to appearing at a conference praising the architects of that very policy as role models. And when confronted with this ideological whiplash, her response is, "It's okay to change your mind." As if we're talking about preferences in ice cream flavors rather than fundamental questions of human rights and dignity. And this is the genius of the celebrity recruitment strategy. It provides cover for the movement's most extreme positions by showing that even people who previously opposed them can come around, even immigrants can support anti-immigrant policies, even black women can endorse white nationalist talking points, even people with LGBTQ fan bases can platform transphobia, and each of these conversions makes it easier for others to follow, creates a permission structure where you don't have to be ideologically consistent, where you don't have to maintain principles, where all that matters is that you're on the winning team, that you have access to power, that you're part of the club, and maybe that's the most depressing part of all this, the way that principle gets traded for proximity to power so casually, so transparently, with so little shame. And I want to draw your attention to the specific ecosystem that enables this, because Nicki Minaj sat for a conversation with Erika Kirk at the Turning Point USA conference, calling conservative activists the cool kids. So part of what's being sold here is cultural capital, the idea that conservatism isn't your grandparents' stuffy Republican Party. It's cool now, it's where the energy is, it's where the celebrities are showing up, and this represents a fundamental shift in how right-wing politics positions itself, moving away from the country club conservatism of the Reagan era towards something that mimics the aesthetics and energy of youth culture, of hip-hop, of social media virality, and Nicki Minaj provides the perfect vehicle for that repositioning, because she brings credibility with young people and people of color that someone like Ben Shapiro could never achieve, and she does it while using language so careless that she calls the vice president an assassin months after the founder of the organization was assassinated. Now let's talk about what happens after moments like this, because the clip will go viral. People will debate whether Minaj meant it literally or figuratively, whether Erika Kirk's response was appropriate, whether this is all much ado about nothing, and in the process of having those debates, the fundamental transgression gets normalized. We accept that this is just how political discourse works. Now, that celebrities can use violent rhetoric to describe elected officials, and the worst consequence is a few days of social media controversy, and this is exactly how political violence is no longer an unimaginable notion. It is becoming a background condition of democratic life, and threats against election workers, armed intimidation at state capitals, and assaults on public officials are increasingly treated as just another data point in an overheated political climate, and the deeper democratic threat is the normalization of political violence, a shift in what citizens and elites see as acceptable behavior, and when intimidation becomes routine, the guardrails of mutual toleration and institutional forbearance erode, creating fertile ground for democratic backsliding. And I need you to understand that this isn't abstract political theory, this is the lived reality we're creating through moments exactly like the one we just watched. Because every time someone uses violent language and faces no real consequences, every time a celebrity platforms extremism and gets rewarded with White House tweets and UN appearances, Every time a political leader refuses to set boundaries around bigotry and gets celebrated as a big tent unifier, we move one step further away from a functional democracy and one step closer to a system where power is maintained through intimidation and violence rather than through persuasion and consent. And the fact that this is happening with a smile, with celebrity endorsements, with appeals to knowing someone's heart rather than judging their words, makes it more dangerous rather than less, because it means we're sleepwalking into authoritarianism while telling ourselves it's just entertainment. So when you watch this clip, when you see Nicki Minaj calling JD Vance an assassin, when you see Erika Kirk laughing it off, when you see MAGA cheering in the background, understand what you're actually witnessing. You're watching the complete collapse of any remaining moral boundaries on the American right. You're watching the weaponization of celebrity culture to launder authoritarian politics. You're watching the construction of a permission structure for political violence. You're watching the normalization of rhetoric that should be absolutely disqualifying, but instead gets treated as a minor gaffe, a slip of the tongue, something we can all just move past because, hey, we know what's in her heart. And if that doesn't terrify you, if that doesn't make you understand the stakes of this moment, then I don't know what will, because we are running out of time to pull back from this precipice. We are running out of opportunities to reassert the norms that make democracy possible, and every moment like this, every casual deployment of violent rhetoric, every celebrity endorsement of authoritarian figures, every refusal to condemn extremism in our midst, brings us closer to the point of no return, and future historians will look back at clips exactly like this one and ask how we let it happen, how we watched it unfold in real time and did nothing, how we allowed entertainment and politics to merge into this toxic spectacle where the language of assassination becomes just another punchline, just another viral moment, just another day in MAGA America, and the answer will be that we simply couldn't believe it was really happening, that we kept telling ourselves it wasn't that serious, that words are just words, that we know what's in their hearts, right up until the moment we discovered that words have consequences and hearts can be filled with darkness, and the circus we mistook for harmless entertainment was actually the opening act of our democratic collapse.